Now we'll be moving into a broader section on static content, and we'll start by talking about regions and landmarks. Most web pages typically have common sections such as headers, not to be confused with headings, navigations, main content areas, and footers. When these different sections use HTML5 elements, they become landmarks. This is very important because landmarks allow screen reader users to navigate more efficiently and gain some insight into the structure and outline of the page, similar to how a visual designer provides cues for those regions and containers through visual styling. Not only is this something that's going to help users understand the content of a page, but it also allows users to quickly jump between landmarks and find things more efficiently. For example, if I were landing on a page and I knew I wanted to conduct a global search of the website, I would probably want to explore within the header, as that's typically where I would expect to find search functionality. Maybe if I'm looking for a Contact Us link, or a sitemap, or perhaps an accessibility statement or information about accessibility, that's the kind of thing I would likely want to explore in the footer. Or perhaps I'm just landing on a page, I already know what's in the navigation, and I want to quickly get to the heart of the page, as in the main content region. It's very important for designers to plan for these sections ahead of time, outlining them in wireframes and templates. But it's the developer's role to take that information and actually implement it using HTML5 section elements or ARIA landmark roles. On the screen, I'm showing a screenshot of the Perkins homepage, with a border outlining the header region, then the main content region, and then the footer region. That's typically going to be the most basic structure of your page, and you'll likely need to incorporate a little bit more. This slide contains a table of the different HTML5 section elements and their counterparts as ARIA roles. While we typically always recommend using HTML first and ARIA as backup, when it comes to landmarks, ARIA roles are very well and broadly supported across all different types of assistive technologies. HTML5 elements and ARIA roles can have overlap or inconsistencies when it comes to naming conventions. For example, a navigation landmark would be called a nav element in HTML5, but in ARIA, it would be role equals navigation. Both of these are well supported, but you only need to use one at a time. If you use the HTML semantic tag, you don't need to worry about the ARIA role. There's a few ARIA landmark roles that are not available in HTML5. One example here is role equals search. There's no HTML equivalent of that. In this case, you would have to use ARIA for the search landmark. When regions of a page have more than one of something, like multiple navigation elements or more than one complementary or aside element, it's important to provide these with unique names by using ARIA label. It's also important not to repeat the name of the region within the label. For example, to label the primary navigation element of the page, you would use ARIA label equals primary, not primary navigation. Using the name of the region is repetitive for screen reader users who would hear the section announced as primary navigation. Now let's turn our attention to headings. You really can't talk about accessibility without talking about headings. The same way visual users might scan headings to quickly understand a page's structure and locate relevant information, screen reader users can also navigate similarly, moving from one heading to the next. There are a number of different ways users can do this. They can simply press the H key, and it will toggle them through all the different headings on the page. If they want to look at specific heading levels, like all the level 2 headings on the page, for example, they can press the number 2 on their keyboard. They can also pull up dialogues that contain a list of all the headings on the page, which can be helpful for screen reader users who have some vision. As a rule, headings must always have hierarchy. In this example, there's a screenshot of a page with various services. There's an H1 at the top, and then nested below in slightly smaller font is a level 2 heading named Featured Services. And nested below that, each individual service is marked as a level 3 heading. And then they provide some additional description and context below them. If a screen reader user were navigating through all the level 2 headings on a page, they would hear Featured Services heading level 2. Now let's take a look at headings from the perspective of compliance. In terms of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, there are certain things that don't constitute an actual failure of WCAG, but you should still follow as best practice. We're typically talking about the info and relationship success criteria when we're talking about headings. An example of a failure would be heading-like text that isn't marked up as a heading, something that's styled to look like a heading and clearly summarizes content that's nested below it. But if that doesn't have heading markup, it would be considered a failure. A variological heading order could constitute a failure. Non-descriptive headings also constitutes a failure. Headings must be descriptive and unique on the page that they're presented on. In some cases, a complete lack of headings is not necessarily a failure, but keep in mind, if something clearly acts as a heading, it must have heading markup. Not all accessibility issues are failures. Some are best practices that should be followed whenever possible. For example, you want to have a level 1 heading on your page that aligns with the page title. Having more than one H1 goes against best practices, but it's not necessarily a failure. The same goes for skipped heading levels. We strongly encourage you to avoid skipping heading levels, but sometimes that's not feasible for various reasons. Remember to always think of your headings as a table of contents for your page. Multiple headings with the same text are acceptable as long as they're descriptive enough, particularly when they're nested below a heading level that provides additional context. Here are some do's and don'ts when it comes to headings. You want to make sure that headings are clearly visible and used to organize and summarize sections of content. Headings should generally be concise while still being meaningful and providing enough information for users to understand what's in the section of the page. Your page should have one primary heading, a level 1 heading at the top of the page that closely aligns with the page title element. Make sure you're consistently using heading markup, H1, H2s, etc., on any content that serves the purpose of a heading. Now for some don'ts. Don't use heading markup on content that doesn't serve the purpose of a heading. As developers, you may not be the one authoring the heading or creating the content on the page, but what you can do is support your content authors by giving them different styling options for various heading levels. That way, they don't feel restricted to certain presentations or designs just to achieve a particular look. Different content management systems allow you to customize the styling of heading levels in different ways, so that's something worth exploring. Also, avoid skipping heading levels. For example, jumping from an H2 to an H4, and don't use too many different heading styles, because this can create a confusing layout or cognitive dissonance for certain users. Now let's talk links and a bit about buttons. Let's look at how link text works in practice using a common card grid pattern. Let's consider a 3-card news grid layout. Now imagine you're a screen reader using tabbing. If the only clickable element is a generic read more link at the bottom of each card, all you would hear is link, read more, link, read more, link, read more. That's really not helpful link text because you have no idea where any of these links are going to, and they definitely go to 3 different pages. So how do we solve for this problem? One solution might be to wrap the entire card within a single link, but that creates the opposite problem. Now the screen reader announces the headline, the description, and read more, all as one long link. That's a lot of context just for a link, and it becomes overly verbose. A better solution is to make the headline itself the link. The headline already describes where you're going. It's the title of the article or page. So instead of generic read more text, the screen reader user would hear more descriptive link text, like link, new environmental regulations take effect, or link, governor announces infrastructure plan. Now each link is unique and meaningful. But what if your design really requires that read more link? There are a few ways to make it accessible while keeping that visual pattern. The first option is to use visually hidden text. You keep read more visible on the screen, but through CSS, you add additional text that only screen readers can access. So visually, it says read more, but the screen reader announces read more, new environmental regulations take effect. The second option is to use ARIA label. ARIA label replaces the accessible name entirely. So instead of the link having the accessible name of read more, you set an ARIA label to read more, new environmental regulations take effect. The third and often best option is to use ARIA labeled by. This attribute takes a set of IDs and combines them to create the accessible name. So you would reference both the ID of the read more text and the ID of the headline. This way, you don't need to duplicate any text, and if the headline changes, the accessible name automatically updates to match. The screen reader would announce, read more, new environmental regulations take effect, combining both elements without requiring you to maintain duplicate content. It's important to ensure links sufficiently describe the destination page. Avoid using generic link text such as click here and read more or get the article. Similarly, avoid using the same link text for links that navigate to different pages. So if you have a lot of pages that all say, get the article, How does anybody who uses a screen reader know where that actually goes? Another best practice is to ensure that you are not linking entire sentences or paragraphs of text, because that can become overly verbose for screen reader users. Imagine going to a link and having an entire paragraph read to you. If you have a link that opens in a new tab or opens in a new document type, such as a PDF, you should always announce where that is going to open to, whether it opens a new window or opens a PDF or downloads a file type. Let's cover a couple do's and don'ts for links. First, do make sure your link text is meaningful, even when taken out of context. Make sure that your links are unique. Make sure that if you have links that are within paragraphs of text, you have color or some other way of differentiating the links from the static text. If you're using color alone to differentiate links from static text, make sure that there's at least a 3:1 color contrast ratio between the link and the static text. As far as don'ts go, don't use generic text such as click here, read more, or get the article. Don't use the same link text for links that navigate to different pages, and don't link entire sections, sentences, or paragraphs of text, because that can become overly verbose. Now, if we're talking about links, it's hard not to talk about buttons versus links, because these are often mixed up. Links should navigate users to a new page or section on the current page. Buttons, on the other hand, trigger an action, such as submitting a form or opening a modal. Sometimes, developers will use a button or a link tag incorrectly or interchangeably. For example, a button element may be used for a CTA, call to action, because it is big and bold. However, in this case, a link tag should be used and styled to look like a button. This will allow the appearance of a button while maintaining the ability for assistive technology to pull up a list of links and recognize this as a link. Sometimes link elements and on-click JavaScript elements are used to create pseudo buttons. You can do this by setting the href attribute to pound or JavaScript void 0 to prevent the page from refreshing. But in many of these cases, using a button element is more appropriate and will properly communicate the role to assistive technologies. This kind of goes back to using ARIA, and remember, only use ARIA when you need to. I would highly recommend using the proper element, either a link or button, when you're intending to use a link or button. You can get around this using other ways. However, it does create additional work, can lead to brittle experiences, and can lead to confusing experiences if not done correctly. A common thing that happens on the web, especially on the mobile web, is the introduction of icon-only buttons. These are buttons that only use an icon to represent the purpose of what the button does. Even these buttons should have an accessible name. Accessible names provide information for assistive technology, such as screen readers, to communicate the purpose of the content. To give an icon button, like the one we have on screen, an accessible name, there are a variety of techniques. One being to put text inside the button, opening and closing tags that describes the button's functionality, and if you don't want it visually shown, you hide that information. On the screen here, we have the Perkins School for the Blind website. We have a hamburger menu up at the top, and that button doesn't have any visible text. However, it actually does have text in it. It's just visually hidden. Let's talk about images. Images that don't have descriptive alternative text are a barrier for people who cannot see the image. This can be incredibly confusing if the image is providing visual information that non-sighted users would miss. There are a few types of images on the web, and I'm categorizing these into 4 buckets. The first is an informative image. An informative image conveys a simple concept or information that can be expressed in a short phrase or sentence. You add alt text to an informative image to make it accessible. The second is a decorative image. A decorative image is non-essential to understanding the context of a page. It's really just eye candy. These can be hidden from assistive technology. The third is a complex image. Complex images contain substantial information, more than can be conveyed in a short phrase or sentence. The example we have here is a chart, which could even be an interactive chart. And the last type is a functional image. A functional image initiates an action rather than conveying information, such as a button, a link, or some other interactive element. The easiest way to provide alternative text on an image is by adding the alt attribute. The alt attribute is read by screen readers in place of the actual image. For informative images, the alt attribute conveys a simple concept or information that can be expressed in a short word or phrase. If there's an image with no alt attribute, screen readers will often announce the image's file name, which is not a great experience. When the alt attribute is left blank, a screen reader will ignore the image entirely, considering it decorative, which is helpful if you have a decorative image. Alternative text should typically be provided by the content author or designer, not the developer. The reason is that the image was selected for a purpose, and it's important to understand why it was chosen and what it's trying to convey. On the right side of the screen, we have an image that has the alt text, "A woman sits outside holding her smartphone while her white cane leans against her leg." This is an example of good alt text. Conversely, we have decorative images. A decorative image is an image that is non-essential to understanding the content or purpose of a page. On the right-hand side of the screen here, we have some links with icons next to them. Icons like this are purely decorative, and they don't communicate any information. Decorative images can be hidden from assistive technology using a variety of means, the easiest of which, if this is truly an image tag, is to enter alt equals blank. This will hide the image from assistive technology, and that's all that needs to be done. There are some other ways to hide images from assistive technology. An example is, how do you hide a decorative image using CSS? Well, if you use CSS to render a background image on a web page, that will not be announced to assistive technology. It's important to know that if you are using a background image to convey something that is important, that does need to be communicated to assistive technology, but by default, it will not be. And when it comes to images, whether you're deciding whether something is informative or decorative, anytime an image is functional, like a linked image, you need to take certain things into consideration. When linking standalone images, it's important that the image has alternative text that serves as the link text. In this example here on the right-hand side of the screen, which is the Perkins logo, I wouldn't want the alternative text for this image to be Perkins logo, because this is really a link. The accessible name of this image is the accessible name of the link. So the alt text for this image is Perkins homepage. The alternative text here describes where the link is supposed to go. So far, most of what we've been talking about is link text and links when it comes to image elements. But if we're dealing with SVGs, there are some extra things to consider. An informative SVG element cannot be described using an alt attribute, so another technique must be used. You have a couple of options. The first is to add the ARIA label attribute to the SVG if the SVG does not have a title element as a child element. You could also use the ARIA labeled by attribute in this scenario. On the right side of the screen, we have a couple different examples of acceptable approaches. We have a profile for Jeff Fried. At the bottom, there's a LinkedIn icon implemented through an SVG. You could have an SVG with role equals link and ARIA label equals view Jeff Fried's LinkedIn profile. Or, if that SVG has a child title element, you could use role equals link and ARIA labeled by equal to the ID of the title. Either of these are acceptable and accessible ways of naming SVGs. Conversely, let's say you have a decorative SVG. How do you hide that? Decorative SVG elements cannot be hidden using null alt, so another technique must be used. An SVG can be hidden from screen readers using the ARIA hidden property. In the example on the right side of the screen, we have a decorative SVG next to the WCAG accessibility audit text. If we look at the code, we would see ARIA hidden equals true on the SVG element. This SVG would then be hidden from assistive technology. In this section, we'll be talking about data tables. To be clear, a data table is a table where the content has specific relationships to each other, and the table layout helps convey those relationships and provide additional meaning and context. What we don't want to do is use tables for layout purposes. For example, to create 3 separate columns on a page. We don't want to do that because of how screen readers and assistive technologies interpret tables. But also because tables can be restrictive when the page tries to reflow or adapt to different viewport sizes. The purpose of a data table is to prevent tabular information in a grid or matrix and to have columns or rows that show the meaning of the information in that grid. For a sighted person, it's easy to quickly scan a table and make visual associations between the data and the appropriate row or column headers. For someone who can't see a table and can't make these visual associations, it's important that we use proper markup so that assistive technology can make a programmatic association between the elements within the table, specifically data cells and header cells. When proper HTML markup is in place, screen reader users can navigate through data tables one cell at a time, and the name of the row or column they're in is announced to them. I'm presenting an example on the screen of delivery slots. Across the first row are column headers. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Going down the first column are different times, and within the individual data cells, it's either open or closed, whether or not the delivery slots are available. If table markup had not been applied in this case, and I navigated across the top as visually presented here, I would hear column 2, Monday, column 3, Tuesday, column 4, Wednesday. Then I would navigate down and hear row 2, open, down again, row 3, closed. I might remember that I'm in the Wednesday column, but it would be very difficult to have memorized the order of the different delivery slots. When proper markup is applied in the same pattern, the user would hear Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Then, when they navigate down the Wednesday column, they would hear 9 to 11, open, 11 to 1, closed. And that goes back to these associations and making sure those relationships are clear. And to do that, we fall back on our semantic HTML. On the left side of the screen, I'm showing partial semantics. We're using table markup, which is good. We have a caption for the table, which is also good. But all of the cells within the table are simply marked up as TD elements, the D standing for data. There's no clear indication of whether there are any column headers or row headers. On the right side, where the semantics are complete, there are a couple of things to note. While this is less critical, if you want to really follow the semantics as intended, you would have a thread element wrapped around your column headers, and then the rest of the table would be wrapped in a T-body element. That's valuable, but where things really become critical is making sure that you mark up your table headers. In this example, I've marked up all of my column headers with TH elements and given them a scope attribute of col, the abbreviation for column. I've also added content in the first cell of time slot and given it a scope of col, because that first column contains time slots. I still want to make sure that my row headers are also marked up in this example. For the first cell in each row, I'm using TH markup and a scope attribute. However, in this case, the scope attribute is set to row because that is the scope of that table header.